Okay. Okay. Thank you, Miles, for the opening. So my name is Kevin Chan. I work at Taiwan's National Academy, Academia Sinica. On behalf of my co-conveners, I welcome you all to the first lecture of the History of Universities online seminar of 2022 to 2023. And this seminar is co-sponsored by Loughborough University, UK, Humboldt University, Berlin, Germany, and Taiwan's Academia Sinica. We are happy to open this year's seminar with Kaspar Risbjerg Eskildsen's talk. Professor Eskildsen, or Kaspar, if I may, received his PhD at the Free University of Berlin in 2003 and has been teaching at Roskilde University in his home country, Denmark, since 2006. He received the Best Article Award from the Forum for the History of Human Science of the History of Science Society of the United States for his publication, Leopold Ranke's Archival Turn, Location and Evidence in Modern Historiography, which was published in Modern Intellectual History 2008. Kaspar is one of the leaders of the international movement to make the history of the humanities as a distinct field. He has worked, for example, with Rensbot of Amsterdam University on the Classics of the Humanities workshop series, which took place at Johns Hopkins, Roskilde, and Amsterdam. He is also a leader of the International Force on Liberal Arts Education. He organized, for instance, European Reform University Alliance, and then Critical Edge Alliance, which is an organization of critical, alternative, and innovative universities across the world. Kaspar has published many articles in the best journals in intellectual history, the history of science, and the history of the humanities. He has just published his monograph, Modern Historiography in the Making, The German Sense of the Past, 1700 to 1800, Bloomsbury, 2022. His talk today will be based on his book and has a slightly different title, Modern Historiography in the Making, Teaching and Research at German Universities, 1700 to 1800. Kaspar will be speaking about 45 minutes, and I will then open the floor for discussion. Let us welcome Kaspar Eskildsen.
Okay, Kevin, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you all for inviting me here and allowing me to speak here. And for those of you who have shown up for the talk. So my book, which I have here, is called Modern Historiography in the Making, the German Sense of the Past, 1700 to 1900. And the premise of the book, a place where I start, is that at the end of the 19th century, German scholars portrayed historical scholarship both as a model and as an ideal. It delivered not only a more secure way to uncover the past, but also a new foundation for the humanities as well as the social sciences. And some even claimed that historical scholarship defined the modern worldview. The modern age, they insisted, was an age of history. So the book investigates how German historical scholarship grew to such prominence. It doesn't have universities in the title, but it is primarily a university history, so I still think it deserves to be presented in this seminar. All the major protagonists are university professors, and it focuses upon practices of research and teaching. So it's about the stuff that professors do. The word "in the making" in the title has a double meaning then. On the one hand, it's about the development of modern scholarship, how it came to be. And on the other hand, it's about processes of research, how knowledge is made in historical scholarship. So why do I think that universities are so important for understanding the history of historical scholarship? To start with, the scholars thought so themselves. They emphasized the importance of universities. From the late 18th century and onwards, scholars repeatedly described a dramatic change in modern history writing, where professionals who had been trained by universities and were employed at universities gradually replaced amateur historians. Other types of historical narratives, of course, continued to exist. However, university historians increasingly defined what counted as correct and truthful knowledge about the past. So in my talk today, I will talk about this different aspects of this transformation as it happened in the German states. So first, I will discuss the redefinition of academic knowledge, which allowed history into the universities in the first place. Secondly, I will talk about the emergence of a new kind of professorial expertise. Third, I will discuss the consolidation of this expertise through educational practices. I will then offer some possible reasons why historical scholarship became so important in the German states. And finally, I will try to explain why this story has been partly forgotten and offer an argument for why it may deserve to be remembered. To start with the beginning, I would like to start with questioning the self-evidence of the prominence of German historical scholarship. There's no reason to believe that it necessarily should gain such importance. At the end of the 17th century, where my book begins, history was not considered as a proper or independent part of academic knowledge. Early modern humanists, of course, revered the philosophy and literature and art of antiquity, but historical knowledge only played a secondary role within academic institutions. True academic knowledge was defined as certain and deducible. It explained matters according to their courses and with reference to universal laws and principles. History only offered fragments. So history did not belong among the 7 canonical arts of the philosophical faculty, the trivium and the quadrivium. And professorial chairs in history were normally combined positions, usually together with philosophy or rhetoric or theology. While some professors did discuss historical material in their courses, this was primarily in the service of other theoretical disciplines. For modern historical scholarship to succeed in universities and even to become dominant at universities, academic knowledge therefore needed to be redefined. This story is well known to historians of the natural sciences. So the empirical and experimental sciences, like historical scholarship, were not considered as independent parts of academic knowledge, and for similar reasons. They were based on fragmented and uncertain knowledge about the world. They therefore largely developed outside universities and academies, salons, and courts. Although, of course, there was exceptions now when I have a world-leading expert on style sitting in front of me. However, still in the late 18th and early 19th century, many major scientists, such as Lavoisier or Humboldt or Darwin, were not affiliated with universities. Only during the 19th century, universities gradually came to dominate research within the natural sciences. The story is somewhat different for historical scholarship. Already during the late 17th century, some German academics started arguing for the independent value of historical knowledge and insisted that it did not need to be supported by more theoretical disciplines to be considered a branch of academic knowledge making. The most prominent example, which I discuss in my book, is the leader of the early German Enlightenment, Christian Thomasius, who helped establish the Reformed University of Halle in 1694. According to Thomasius, historical knowledge was fundamentally different from the knowledge of the more philosophical disciplines, but it was no less important for universities or for university teaching. It should be considered, in Thomasius' formulation, as the second eye of wisdom. In Halle, he secured history a central place across the faculties, and especially in the faculty of law. Halle also housed the first German school of history writing, the School of Imperial History, Reichshistorie. So Thomasius' definition of knowledge did not last long. In 1703, Christian Wolff, on the recommendation of Leibniz, was hired as a professor of mathematics in Halle. And in the following decades, Wolff introduced a new rationalistic school of Enlightenment philosophy. He was banished to Marburg in 1724 after praising the practical philosophy of the Chinese, but nonetheless, his school increasingly defined German Enlightenment philosophy. Wolff reinstated a definition of academic knowledge as theory based upon certain and universal principle, and historical knowledge as auxiliary to theory. Historical knowledge was the bare knowledge of facts, and in Wolff's words, the lowest grade of human knowledge. Others concurred. In 1739, the newly founded University of Göttingen, another major Enlightenment university in Germany, considered the leader of the School of Imperial History, Johann Peter von Ludewig, who was known for his vast knowledge of German archives, for a chair. One influential educational reformer rejected this proposal and scornfully remarked, I will quote here, "It doesn't matter that Ludewig has seen into more archives than that in Magdeburg. What can I learn from an archive apart from particularities about a country that others don't know? This doesn't belong to scholarship, which of course is about universals. Otherwise, all archivists would be more learned than other people, although one sees the contrary. It is a mistake when one attributes Ludewig's learning and reputation to the archives. Yes, I'm quite sure that the inspection of archives has harmed him more than helped him." Tomasius' reforms of the university curriculum nonetheless proved doable. During the 18th century, universities across the German states established chairs in history. That the University of Göttingen considered hiring Ludewig shows this. And the same that some people considered his knowledge of archives as important. However, historians still struggled to defend their discipline on theoretical grounds. An interesting example is the Göttingen professor Johann Christoph Gatterer, who in the 1760s wrote a series of essays in which he tried to defend historical scholarship within a Wolffian theoretical framework, even if these arguments had no connection whatsoever to his actual work as a historian. Among his contemporaries, he was mostly known for his almost pedantic mastery of the auxiliary historical sciences such as paleography and genealogy and heraldics, not for finding new universal truth out of studying the past. However, despite of the lack of theoretical justification, historical scholarship had become institutionally accepted. In the 19th century, when the modern disciplines emerged, historians were already in place and ready to claim the independence of their discipline. The historical discipline, they argue, had its own objects, the written remains of the past, and its own methodology, the critical reading of these written remains. So history did not need to justify itself on theoretical grounds. This concept of historical expertise was in itself recent. And I here come to the second point of my presentation. Before the 18th century, the proper historian was normally described as someone with personal and immediate experience of the events. The statesman or the general who had witnessed the making of history was also the person who could describe it more vividly and more accurately. So there was no distinction between the eyewitness and the historian. One should prefer history seen from history heard or read, and if an eyewitness account existed, this account has precedence before later historical works. However, during the 18th century, starting already in the 17th, of course, European scholars increasingly questioned if any historical testimonies could be considered trustworthy. The eyewitnesses might have privileged access to the events, but personal viewpoints, loyalties, opinions, and emotions most likely also colored their accounts. For later readers, it would therefore be almost impossible to understand what really happened in the past. A culmination of this kind of skeptical critique can maybe be thought of as Leopold von Ranke's Kritik neuer Geschichtsschreiber from 1824, where he went through all the major and most trusted Renaissance historians and took them down one after another for being biased and not trustworthy. One common solution to this skeptical critique of testimony was to point to sources that could be considered as non-testimonial. That is, sources that did not offer narrative accounts of the past, but were themselves relics of past events, such as coined medals, inscriptions, monuments. Some written sources also could be considered as non-testimonial. German historians especially emphasized the value of official and legally binding documents which could be found in archives. These documents were remains of the events of themselves and therefore offered a more secure basis for reconstructing the past. The most reliable historian was therefore not the statesman or the general who had experienced the events. It was instead the academic who could identify these sources, new modern source criticism. It was someone who mastered the auxiliary historical sciences and did not allow his imagination to run wild. This ideal of the historian is also discussed in Ranke's 1824 book. Contrary to the rhetorically gifted amateur historians of the Renaissance, the modern historian, he claimed, presented, quote, the naked truth without any ornaments, thorough research of the particular, the rest left to God, only no fiction, also not in the smallest, only no fantasy. This emphasis upon critical expertise, however, created a new problem. How could the reader of historical works know that the expert possessed the necessary skills, could identify the correct documents in the archives, and did not suffer from excessive imagination? The new emphasis upon archival documents only increased this problem. Even if the historian had access to the sources in the archives, most of their readers would not be able to check their findings. They therefore relied upon the credibility of the historian. So we are back to the same problem as we had with the critique of testimonies before, in this case, just the testimony of the historian. The answer to this problem was education. So here I come to the third point in my presentation. At the end of the 19th century, historians around the world referred to Leopold von Ranke as the founder of the historical discipline. However, they seldom did so with reference to his writings, such as his 1824 book on Renaissance historians. That book was actually never translated in full to any language, as far as I know. They instead emphasized the importance of his seminar at the University of Berlin. The history of university seminars has, of course, in recent years received renewed attention, especially because of the work of Bill Clark. And it is probably well known to everyone here. The first seminar of classical philology was established at the University of Göttingen in 1738. And after 1777, the seminar became the model. That seminar became a model for a series of similar seminars at other German universities. By the end of the 19th century, seminars had been introduced at all German universities and in all humanities disciplines. The seminars were institutions funded by the state and not just a type of instruction. They had their own statutes, directors, and budget for expenses, scholarships, prizes, and books. The teaching focused upon exercises, Übungen. Professors seldom lectured, but instead gave the students tasks to solve. And if you are interested in these teaching practices, I will recommend Carlos Borhase and Mark Georg Dahlmann's description of Friedrich August Wolff's seminar in Halle. Leopold von Ranke, many later 19th century historians claimed, was the founder of the seminar tradition within the historical discipline. This claim, however, runs contrary to all evidence. Ranke never taught in a seminar, and the University of Berlin was one of the last German universities to establish a historical seminar. Some of Ranke's students also rejected the new institution. His most celebrated student, the Göttingen professor Georg Weitz, detested the seminars and complained that students here learned, quote, method, but not the spirit or art of history writing. The purpose of seminars was to educate high school teachers, not to prepare future researchers. So what late 19th century historians celebrated was not the seminar institution as such, but rather an approach to research education, which by then also gradually was introduced into some seminars. The way Ranke taught was that he gathered a group of his most prominent students for exercises in his private home, around a large wooden desk in his study. The few students who were accepted here were expected to do original research and write published papers and present them to one another. The papers did not really remind of Ranke's own books. They were remarkably uniform in style. They follow a strict chronological order, often with a year noted in the margin. My cat wants to be part of the presentation. And had an excessive critical apparatus, which, as Tony Grafton has noted, Ranke's own books did not. In Göttingen, Weitz followed this tradition, offered classes in his home, and taught his students to write in a similar standardized format. So you could trust historians of the Ranke school because they had been trained in a particular way and had learned to work according to the same procedures and employing the same methods. This was the ideal of teaching that 19th century historians celebrated and attempted to introduce all over the world. So most famously at the École Pratique in France, or the Johns Hopkins University in the United States, or the Imperial University in Tokyo, Japan. The tradition of private history teaching, it should be noticed, did also not start with Ranke, but goes back to the early Enlightenment. This tradition should not be confused with the normal early modern distinction between public and private lectures, which differentiated between lectures which students could attend for free and those that they had to pay for. Often the history classes were described as public in the lecture course, lecture catalog, so free of charge, but nonetheless the teaching took place in the professorial home and only a few selected students were allowed in. To understand why this form of teaching emerged, this is necessary to move on to the next point in my presentation, to the question why historical scholarship became so important in the German states. As already mentioned, we should not take this for granted. The empirical and experimental sciences largely developed outside of the universities and only gradually made their way in. Still, in 1840, the chemist Justus von Liebig complained about the lack of funding for teaching laboratories at Prussian universities. Now, a university professor complaining about the lack of research funding is, of course, not specifically surprising. However, when the Prussian government investigated the matter, many of Liebig's contemporaries simply rejected the value of teaching laboratories. The philosophical faculty at the University of Berlin, for example, rejected this form of practical teaching because, I quote, this was only indispensable for those who are not going to dedicate themselves to industry and manufacturing. It therefore belonged in trade schools, not at universities. So why did German universities accept historical scholarship already from the beginning of the 18th century, even if it did not fit into the normal definition of academic knowledge? So during the early modern period, the most common argument for the usefulness of history was the Ciceronian claim that history was a teacher of life, Historia Magistra Vitae. History served a pedagogical purpose, illustrating moral principles and confirming religious truth. It supported and delivered material to the theoretical disciplines. Already during the early Enlightenment, prominent advocates of historical scholarship, such as Christian Thomasius and Johann Peter von Ludewig, explicitly rejected this argument. They did not question that history was useful for life, quite the contrary, but they rejected the usual early modern justification for why it should be considered useful. Historical scholarship was not useful because it illustrated universal principles, but on the contrary, because it uncovered a world of differences. It showed that contemporary institutions were not natural or necessary. They had changed in the past and they could change again. So historical scholarship allowed contemporaries to imagine that reforms and changes were possible. So one central example I discuss in the book that keeps on recurring is the reinterpretation of the Holy Roman Empire and the critique of the old idea of the four world monarchies, which have been taken over from medieval interpretations of the book of Daniel, but still was common in the 18th century. The confrontation with the differences of the past, moreover, taught people to accept and tolerate such differences in the contemporary world. Historical scholarship, the later Göttingen professor Christoph August Heumann argued in 1716, accustomed people to, quote, endure the brightness of paradoxical truth. It ensured that we, quote, do not become stubborn in our opinions and prepared the readers for modesty in dispute and tolerance in disagreements. So historical scholarship was not only different from philosophy and theory, it served as a countermeasure against excessive philosophizing or theorizing. It was a weapon against a form of academic knowledge that had helped justify the confessional state, and with the confessional state, centuries of religious war, censorship, and suppression. This was probably also why some history classes should be taught in private. They not only conveyed knowledge about the past, but they also challenged the contemporary world, and they were venues for personal reflection and transformation. The idea that private history classes served personal transformation still survived in some forms in the 19th century. So the commitment to scholarly standards was often described in a language of virtues, and these virtues should be acquired in the private exercises. As the French historian Gabriel Monod later described the experience of participating in Geovite's exercises in Göttingen, and I quote again, "One left these lessons not just better instructed, not just with clearer ideas and a better ordered mind, but also with love and respect for truth and scholarship, with understanding for the price that they cost and resolution to work for them. One sensed that Mr. Weiss pushed his entire soul into this informal and direct teaching, that he wanted to accomplish a moral as well as an intellectual work, that he wanted to form men as well as scholars." The idea that historical scholarship served as a countermeasure against excessive philosophizing and theorizing also did not end with the demise of the confessional state. Still in the 19th century, it was a common argument for the usefulness of history. Historical scholarship worked not only against the theological dogmatism of the past, but also against the new dogmas of ideology. Germans now suffered, the historian Heinrich von Schübel argued in 1856, from two versions of speculative politics, where the left appealed to philosophy and the right to theology. Historical scholarship served as an alternative, Schübel claimed, by showing the practical lessons of history. The double task of the historian became, quote, to forcefully enliven the connection between past and present, and to use the old not to exterminate, but to develop further the new. Historians should not only show their fellow Germans that reform and progress were possible, but also reassure them about the continuities between past and present. There was no eternal theological order to which the German states could or should return, but there was also no revolutionary necessity which disconnected the contemporary world from the past. Historical scholarship played this political function not by adjusting itself to changing political ideas, but on the contrary, by uncovering the past as carefully and thoroughly as possible. Historical scholarship played a political function in society as historical scholarship. Historians were political because they investigated archives, critiqued and edited sources, and reconstructed the strange world of the past. So there was no contradiction between the claim that history served a political purpose and thorough and rigorous historical research. Even Georg Waitz, who was known as the most critical and objective historian of his time, defended the political function of historical scholarship. Historical scholarship wanted to present, he claimed in 1859, the true meaning of things and their value for life. But he continued, it will only solve this assignment worthily when it approaches us soberly and calmly, clear-eyed and unprejudiced, when it realizes that there are limits to its knowledge. So now this is not the story normally told about the emergence of modern historical scholarship, and this brings me to my last point. Why this history was partly forgotten and why we maybe should remember it. After the First World War, German scholars started questioning the moral purpose of historical scholarship. The debates about historicism were especially important for this revision of the German view of the past. In some ways, these debates only confirmed the belief that the modern age was an age of history. In 1922, in an influential book that framed the discussion, the theologian Ernst Troeltsch associated historicism with the fundamental historicizing of our knowledge and thinking. The triumph of history, however, was no longer just a cause for celebration. The historization of European thinking, according to Troeltsch, had undermined belief in norms and values. The challenge, moreover, did not come from historical scholarship itself, but was the product of a larger shift in the European worldview, which started during the second half of the 18th century and found its clearest expression in philosophical relativism, especially in the works of Rousseau and Herder. Variations of this story can still be found in recent works on German historicism and historical scholarship. For most 18th and 19th century historians, however, this story would seem rather odd. They did not consider Rousseau or Herder as major inspirations, and they were convinced about the moral and political significance of their work. From the viewpoint of the history of universities, it also seems odd to blame changes in the historical worldview during the 18th century for the loss of moral purpose at the beginning of the 20th century. This development was not unique to the historical discipline. During the first decades of the 20th century, universities increasingly embraced vocational ideals and insisted upon the importance of disciplinary specialization and value-free research. Moral and political education was no longer the responsibility of professors, but either irrelevant to universities or outsourced to the Students' Affairs Office. The historical discipline may not have abandoned its moral and political purpose because there was some fundamental shift in the historical worldview, but rather because all the other disciplines did as well. The German debates about historicism may merely be a symptom of this institutional transformation. So now I come to my conclusion. So the early 20th century insistence that historical scholarship should be value-free re-emphasized the difference between ideology and scholarship. But the claim also hid the conflict and so the moral and political import. However, the transformative power of historical scholarship does not depend upon the recognition of historians. If we can believe the 18th and 19th century historians I've talked about, it changes the world by uncovering the past. Since the beginning of the 20th century, historians have continued to challenge universal and immutable viewpoints and questioning contemporary institutions, politics, and moral standards. The constant expansion of the profession and conquest of new territories also brought the challenges and questions to these fields. The strongest expression might be the use of the historical methods I've talked about on the histories of non-European parts of the world. Acknowledging the hidden moral and political history of modern historiography may be valuable. The way we view the past is not simply the result of the validity of our methods. These methods may be valid and lead us closer to the past. However, other ways of viewing the past were and continue to be possible. Modern historiography was a choice which demanded effort, endless hours of work, and considerable financial and institutional support. It is a choice that can be unmade again if we no longer find it worthwhile. Governments could close the archives and universities could stop hiring history professors. In some ways, this is already happening, so such a future is not unthinkable. The disappearance of modern historical scholarship would not mean the end of history writing. Humankind has always told stories about the past, and most likely, humankind will continue to do so in the future. These will just be other kind of stories, such as the story about the four world monarchies, which most Europeans until relatively recently believed was the best interpretation of world history. The disappearance, however, would result in the demise of a vision of modernity, which has shaped us and our societies over the last 3 centuries. And I think we should be aware of this choice. I think I will stop there. Thank you.